Anyway, welcome everybody, also those following our discussion this evening. I'm very happy to welcome back to SAIS Europe, Myriam Ferran, and a former colleague from the Commission in Brussels, way back when, and when she visited previously, which we could hardly believe was 7 years ago. She was working in what was then the DG NEAR on enlargement. But for the last 3 years, she's been in the DG, which has the Orwellian acronym INTPA, which stands for International Partnerships. We used to call it development, which I think somehow conveys something, but INTPA anyway, where Myriam is Deputy Director-General. And I thought we would begin very informally, well, to do this as a dialogue, initially between the two of us, and then bringing you in at any point where you wish to jump in. But I thought it would be interesting to begin with, if Myriam shared with us a little bit about her career, about her transition to development, about the work of the department where you are now. And we'll go on from that to some substantive policy questions. So, Myriam, please, welcome.
Thank you and good evening all. It's really a pleasure to be back here. And I would never have believed it was 7 years ago that I came for the first time, but I remember vividly that I really enjoyed the evening. So I hope it will be, and I'm sure it will be the same today. A few words maybe on how I reached the position of Deputy Director General in the European Commission in charge of development. I think we can say this today, even though it's not allowed anymore. And I will explain. I think this evening will give us the occasion to understand why we moved from development to international partnership, because it's really at the core of the transformation of the development policy. But this aside, so I'm engineer in agronomics by training, but always was passionate by international relations, except that I'm French, and the French education system is kind of rather rigid, and it's really difficult to move from an area to another one. And then I finished my studies in Brussels, doing a master in European studies, and realized and got to know the Commission, and realized that you could easily, it was kind of a super administration compared to the French system, but where mobility, cross-sector mobility was possible. So it took me some 10 years actually to get in. I was working in the French Ministry of Agriculture in very interesting files like food security or labeling, but still I had kept in mind the wish to work in foreign relations. And then I went through the opposition to the European Commission and tried to enter in the Director General's dealing with external relations. And then I got many replies saying, but look, man, with your CV, please go to DG Agri. I'm sorry, guys, I want to join the Commission because I want to do external relations. And it took me quite a while, but in 2016, this is where I landed in the field of enlargement in a very fascinating moment. I entered the Commission in 2001 when we were really preparing Big Bang enlargement, and this was really fascinating. I started with working on Estonia, Malta, then the enlargement happened, but all the candidates were in the framework, and the Western Balkans were applying. Actually, there still are. And then I spent several years, nearly 10, I think, working on the accession process of the Western Balkans and Turkey. Turkey was kind of a little bit less consensual, but really interesting too. And so I stayed in the Commission in many positions. I was head of unit for Iceland during the year where Iceland was a candidate, and I look with satisfaction to the fact that they're applying again. So it was really an interesting file too, completely different from the context of the Western Balkans or Turkey. I headed a unit in charge of Serbia and then Turkey. And after a while, I got the opportunity to move to development. And it's a different policy, but still quite similar. The enlargement policy works more with a kind of stick and carrot approach, because the ultimate objective is to have, first you're dealing with countries that have applied to join the European Union, so that are demandeurs. And for that, they need to integrate the whole of the EU legislation. So it's really negotiating on helping them to implement the full range of policies that the European Union is implementing. In the field of development, well, you're in a completely different paradigm. You're helping countries, but who remain totally different from the European Union and have no aspiration to apply EU legislation. So the approach is really different. And this is where we just undertook a change recently, that we used to deal with those countries more in a donor recipient. Us in the European Union, we are giving you money, usually grants, to help you develop. And this relationship is changing, not least due to the current geopolitical changes. And this is where we're having a policy which is completely shifting and which again is fascinating.
I mean, we always used to congratulate ourselves in a way that the EU and its member states together were the largest providers of overseas development assistance in the world, and that this was one of the more enlightened areas of EU policy. I mean, before we come to current realities and challenges, I mean, broadly speaking, can one continue to say that the EU shows the way and is a sort of model for relations with developing countries? Or is this something that is put more and more into question?
Well, we can continue saying that the EU and our member states, we remain the major providers of official development assistance in the world. We're providing 42% of the overall ODA, which is a little bit less than 100 billion a year. But the question is this assistance, does this assistance make us visibly the key partner of the third countries? And the answer to this is clearly no. What we have been witnessing is a clear loss in the visibility and in the influence the European Union could have, even as a model or for the values we're carrying. And when in many countries, we're conducting a lot of surveys and opinion polls, and you hardly find a country where the European Union will be seen as the main aid provider or partner. And then we're losing against China for sure, Russia in some cases, Japan in many places, and we're faced with a lot of disinformation. So this is the reality, and this is one of the reasons why we decided that the model that we're implementing, giving grants essentially with nothing in return, might not be the best model, be it for the European Union or for our partners.
And how are we changing the model then? I mean, you say that in the past it was with no strings attached.
Exactly.
Although in trade policy, we tried to pursue non-trade objectives, right? Like labor laws, labor conditions, environmental provisions, and so on. So with what we used to call anyway, development assistance, are we moving towards a more conditional approach?
In a sense, yes. Yes, we are moving towards a more transactional approach, but it stems from the observation. It's not only a relation of power. It stems also from the observation that even though we are the biggest provider, what we provide altogether remains peanuts compared to the needs. I think the overall needs for infrastructure investment are estimated worldwide at some $4 trillion a year. The ODA altogether is hardly 0.2% of this
From all donors.
from all donors. So and public funding will never be enough to match the investment needs. So one of the changes implies that we need more and more to work with the private sector and tap into private capital. And to do this, the interest of the European Union is to work with the European private sector to assist to provide more foreign direct investment, but the objective remains local growth and jobs. So we have a more transactional partnership because we cannot continue financing bits and pieces of everything everywhere. So the objective now is to have a policy which is much more focused, negotiated with the governments and the civil society and the businesses, so with the society of our partners. So by country or by region, we identify a limited number of priorities where we want to invest. And of course, if we decide to focus, we're going to focus on priorities on which we as Europeans have a direct interest. And this is where the transactional element enters into force. Those priorities, all this new approach has been formalized within a strategy which we call Global Gateway, which was adopted in December 2021. And these strategies calls for support to sustainable connectivity in the 5 biggest challenges that we consider we are facing collectively with the rest of the world. So global challenges: fight against climate change, and for the European Union, it was the Green Deal, digitalization, need for increased connectivity in transport and energy, and then continued support to human development, so education and health. So we tend to focus our support to those priorities, but only a limited number per country. And when we select those, one of the objectives of the European Union is also to ensure its own strategic autonomy. Because if we look back, and the COVID crisis was a key demonstration of the dependencies we were all submitted to. One objective has been to identify what is really lacking today to allow the European Union to get strategically autonomous. And this importantly boils down to all the agreements we're seeking on critical raw materials, for instance. Or so we are looking really to see where we can have a partnership where we also safeguard your interest. So to your question, yes, but also developing our partner countries.
But how do we'll come to in a few minutes, right?
I'm ready to jump in.
Guarantee. Yeah. But okay, so we have the European Union has 5 broad areas that you've described, which are priorities for us, but they're not necessarily priorities for the beneficiaries, or they may not see it like that, and particularly climate, no? And with the sort of global South rhetoric, as it were, well, there's quite a bit of pushback from that, no? That you went through your development period polluting like crazy in the 19th, early 20th century and so on. You're asking us to do things that you didn't do yourselves and so on. So how are they responding now to us coming along and saying, look, these are our key priorities, will you please buy into them? I mean, how does that work in practice?
Actually, and maybe surprisingly, it works well. Because if you engage, it depends on how you engage.
Yeah.
If you engage on the overall discussion over the Green Deal, so when we engage on the normative aspect, and in particular the regulation which have an external impact, like the one on deforestation, or what we call CBAM, which is a tax for carbon content of imported goods. When we discuss the regulation, then we got clear rejection, and this leads to very tough discussions. When we speak of our cooperation agenda, and we come with our 5 priorities. When you look at fight against climate change, you have a clear interest from the countries because they're the first victims of climate change. So we speak not only of adaptation and trying to provide them with technologies which lower the emissions, but also with mitigation. So providing for risk disaster preparedness, compensations for impact of climate change. Most of our partner countries have very large source of renewable energy, be it sun, wind, or hydropower. Us helping on developing renewable energy is a no-brainer, and they completely abide to it. Digitalization is a clear example where they have an interest, not least to get what we help in many countries is reaching last mile digitalization. So for the most remote areas through satellite solutions or then in some cases, there is also a geopolitical interest. If we look at Central Asia, we have a huge, very large program on digitalization in Central Asia. The non-hidden objective is to provide them with strategic autonomy. So far, the only data provider and internet provider is Russia. The objective of the satellite connectivity is for them to be autonomous in terms of data management. So the way we present our offer is also based on values, meaning no strings attached. And this is an alternative model to other support. So it's supposed to be transparent in terms of public procurement rules. We make sure, if we speak of digitalization, to have data protection included. When we seek memoranda of understanding on access to critical raw materials, we're not just buying raw material and bringing back to Europe. It comes with respect of environmental and governance standards. It comes from support to local added value, so training of workforce, support to local private sector, and our offer embeds usually what we call an ecosystem, an overall ecosystem. So we are not just funding an infrastructure, a road, a bridge, or an airport, but we are looking at all the other elements that can make this investment provider of jobs and growth in the country. So we can provide training programs, we can provide accompanying regulatory environment measures. So this kind of offer is usually well accepted. So we don't really have a rejection when we elaborate our programs. But of course, those programs go also with necessary reforms for access to, in particular, the business environment. And there, yes, we have negotiations.
One of the comments that we used to get, I mean, with aid programs from DG Enlargement, but I'm sure also from your service now, from the Court of Auditors, from NGOs like Ground Truth and others that are really looking at the impact and the effectiveness of our assistance. And sometimes it's said that, we are more concerned to complete the correct procedures internally so that no one goes to prison, basically, but without really being absolutely sure about the final provision of assistance at the end and the impact that it has. I mean, faced with these kind of comments, have there been adaptations in recent years to try and ensure that indeed the assistance is being used in the way that we intend?
Well, I think we always tried.
Yeah,
It's not
yeah.
that we didn't try when
Yeah.
we got the comments.
Yeah.
It's very difficult. Now, what is very difficult is to get a clear demonstration that the limited European intervention is going to have an impact on the whole sector. Because when we contribute, we only contribute to part. We're not supporting completely running of a third country. So it's a minor intervention in one or another sector. So it remains a challenge. The way we work now, and the big difference is we gave a supporting infrastructure some 20 years ago to do a lot of basically essentially human development, education, health, governance, justice reforms. And we used a lot of budget support, providing funding directly to the government of our partner countries with specific indicators, but for them to run the national sectors. We're more and more coming back to support to infrastructure as an enabler for growth and jobs. And the latest studies show that gap in infrastructure is a real impediment to economic growth. So we are more and more looking at big projects, big infrastructure projects, but with a full surrounding environment. And actually, one of the reasons is also because it's much easier to show the impact of one identified big project localized in a specific place than just contribute part and parcel to the development of the education policy or the reform of the justice system of a country. So I think by this shift, we are maximizing the chances of being able to measure really the impact of our policy on the ground.
Well, I would have lots more questions, but I'd like to open up the discussion. And I think that Professor Maza was the first to raise her hand. If you'd introduce yourselves briefly.
Yes,
please.
I'm Professor Matza. I teach here a course on labor markets in developing economies, but I also work for the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank. And so, I first started with our question about the constraints of the grant instrument. And it's the same constraint that faces USAID and other instruments. Plus you have, I guess in the EU, you have the other national development institutes, you have GTZ, and so they want to do their thing. So I wanted to sort of, is there any thinking about the limitations of the grant instrument? You don't have the big loans for the big impact. You don't have the pairing with foreign direct investment that the Chinese have. So is there any rethinking of the limitations of that instrument? And the question of impact indicators are poor students find the pressure. Little grant has the same impact indicators as big grant or big loan. That is, we haven't really modernized in the way that you're talking about it to scale the impact indicator to the actual intervention. So I know it's a challenge, but I'm wondering how you see it.
Well, thanks for your question, because you allow me to touch upon something I haven't mentioned at all now. I presented you the objective of this new strategy, Global Gateway, and the fields in which we intervene. But one of the paradigm shifts we're also undertaking is in the how, the way we are implementing EU assistance. And the first one is, I mentioned we wanted to select big projects. So to answer your question, small grants versus big projects, we try to go for much bigger interventions. And of course, if you speak big, you can't speak only grants. So we're changing the approach first by working not only the European Commission implementing the European budget alone on its corner, but through what we called the Team Europe approach, meaning we have developed a real coordination mechanism with our member states, with the administration of the member states, but essentially with the banks, the national development banks of the member states, and the European Development Bank. So the European Investment Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and the, not 27, because not all member states have a development agency, but quite many. The Agence Française de Développement, KfW, GIZ, Cassa Depositi, and all of those. So we are now working together with the member states, defining what we call flagship projects. So in a country, we decide with a partner country that we we have a project to develop the port of Kotor. We go together. So the European budget is used to first have some grants, but extremely limited. So we're limiting the amount of grants just because we consider the leverage effect in terms of investment supported is not worth it. So we use technical assistance and grants essentially for technical assistance, feasibility studies, regulatory reforms. But we use the grants to work with the banks or the national development banks in a blending modality. So using the grant to allow for a better concession rate and of loans. And recently we have developed a new tool, which are the budgetary guarantees. So now we use those grants just to de-risk private sector investment through programs which are financed by the banks. And so I mentioned Team Europe, national development banks, and what we are doing with those funds and the programs financed by the banks is de-risk private investment from the European private sector, bringing private capital into the equation. So we are still using grants, but much less. And this is the big shift. And we try to use the grant just to leverage private capital, working through the banking system with our national development banks.
That's Gilbert.
Well, thank you. That was extremely interesting. I think my question, and I'm sorry if I've taken it from anybody else, follows on from exactly what you've just said. And I was thinking of, I don't know, just my own work on how on the Casa del Mezzogiorno, and it went through a phase in which they did everything humanly possible to build up the south of Italy very gradually, using initiatives with money from the World Bank and so forth, different kinds of environmental and skills building and all the different things that you were talking about. And then they moved to a phase of major infrastructure projects, most of which finished up as Cattedrale nel Deserto. No? Now, in part, you've answered the question that I was going to ask you, which is how do you choose your partners? And you're saying that this is going to be done through private enterprise making investments, well, question mark. Is this how it's going to be done? Are you going to be judging by private enterprise saying we will get a return on this, question mark? I mean, how are you going to stop it? How are you going to stop many of these projects finishing as cathedrals in the desert?
Well, by the way, I would say, by the way we are conceiving them, with sustainability embedded in the design of the project. So let me give you an example maybe of what we're doing. We have a huge project, which is very much sponsored or was by the US. Also, we're working in partnership with the US, what we call the Lobito Corridor, which is going from Angola through Zambia up to the Democratic Republic of Congo. And the objective is to develop, so this corridor goes through the copper belt in Zambia to the mining resources in DRC and leading to the Lobito port in Angola. The objective is to build a railway and a road to link all the sides, expand the port of Lobito so that it is to have a deep sea water port that allow export of critical raw materials and many other commodities, including to the European Union, but not only, of course, having all along the road development poles with training and teaching capacities, all private sector companies developing economic activities all around the corridor. And of course, having EU companies contributing to the building, but in a complementary manner. It can be railway companies, it can be logistics companies. And all the development poles, and well, this would encompass teaching, well, schools or in particular technical and vocational education training facilities to train the local population to the skills needed for the running of the whole corridor in each of its sections. So we do anticipate at least sustainability of the infrastructure we are contributing to build, and avoid with the objective, of course, of avoiding the white elephants from from the previous period.
Yes, the Chinese are building more white elephants.
Yes, I was just. We got enough of them.
Putting a couple of students. Yeah. Introduce yourself, please.
Hi, I'm Minso. I'm actually a Master of Arts and European Public Policy student here at SAIS, so studying the EU. I really appreciate the very in-depth explanation of what European direct assistance looks like, especially in infrastructure. What I wanted to ask, and I apologize if this is if this is related to what's happening right now in the US. It seems like the US is very much dead set on just dismantling USAID and what it's doing. I'm wondering, where does that leave the Europeans and their overseas development assistance? Because the Americans were also the other big foreign development partner on the world stage, and they did a lot of direct assistance.
So we are currently assessing the direct impact of the nearly closure of USAID on many of the programs we are implementing. So far, our fear is much more on the global impact this decision may have, in particular on NGOs, and in particular in the humanitarian field, than on projects that would be co-financing. So the assessment will be, the fear we're having is more on the direct impact on the health sector, where USAID was very active and where there can be a worldwide impact if we speak of all the programs against communicable diseases. We also fear an impact in partner countries, many of whom may be highly affected. And if this is a long-term impact, it can also have consequences on the migration flows stemming from those countries. And then we will go much more granular to see whether we had many programs jointly with USAID, which closure may impact individual projects. And the objective, there is no way the European Union can fill in the gap. I think USAID had a budget of some 60 billion a year in assistance worldwide. This is a budget that, one, the European Union doesn't have. Plus, the European Union can be considered as payer of last resort in case any of its partners would default. But what we're looking at is whether in the cases where this can have an impact and jeopardize the programs we are running ourselves, and in which case we will see compensation, the extent to which we can compensate by reallocation of other programs. So it will be a granular analysis. But there is no way that for budgetary and political reasons that we would step in and compensate. But of course, we will compensate, as we're saying, in terms of where we see a direct interest for the European Union. But we are feeling really an impact on, in particular, on the NGOs.
Thank you so much for being here. This is really interesting. I also study European public policy, but I have no background in development, so my question is also a bit broader. I was wondering, I think it's really such an interesting situation or dynamic that you also touched upon this, like sometimes this lack of visibility in the recipient countries. And I can't help but thinking that the EU's international partnerships or development approach functions as some kind of substitute for the common foreign policy that we don't have. I was wondering how you feel about that. And also, just as a thought experiment, if we had a more aligned common and security policy in a more supranational way, how would you think that would impact your work in your DG? Thank you.
Well, I wouldn't say that it complements, or I don't know exactly the word you used in terms of foreign policy. We really see development policy as part and parcel of foreign policy, and in particular of economic foreign policy. So for us, we are really part of the foreign policy trend, and it's also part of the refocusing of the development policy, because for 20 years, as much as we didn't finance infrastructure, we also pushed for a development policy which tended to be quite independent from foreign policy and closer to humanitarian assistance. We are now making a shift for the reason I explained and the way we're working that brings back development policy as a clear leg of our own economic policy. So I don't see a difference, but then the question is that of visibility. And it's clear that the EU wages under its weight in terms of visibility. So would we have, I'm not sure I can answer your second question. Would we have a supranational security policy? Maybe we would be more visible, but I don't see us yet there. So very prosaically, what we're trying to do is much more focused and better campaigns within the countries, stopping communicating about ourselves via posts on X or photos from the ambassadors, but much more trying to build stories that speak to the people, working with local influencers. So using a different approach to strategic communication. We're also doing a lot of work to counter disinformation, which is undermining us in many countries. But it's a long-term approach. And so far, I think we do really have an image and communication deficit.
Build on that for 1 second, come to Jessica in a moment. And how does this work now within the institutions? Because, I mean, there was a sort of external relations family, no, in the commission with the different services, which in some way or other have an impact beyond the EU's own borders. And then, of course, now since Treaty of Lisbon, there's been another institution, the European External Action Service, that sort of believes that it should give a lead in terms of political objectives and so on. How does that work out in terms of coordinating? Everybody do their own thing, or are these things linked up? I know it's very early in the life of a new commission, so this is looking back a little bit.
No, the things definitely link up. And I would say more easily, given the shift we have been making where we consider development policy part of the foreign policy. So it's a natural leg of foreign policy, plus the fact that we are looking very much to EU competitiveness. And in that sense, the new economic development policy also is kind of the external projection of the European competitive reforms we want to make. So this makes it a much more integrated policy within the overall foreign policy negotiations. And if I give you a clear example, if you look at the political guidelines of the President von der Leyen and the new communications that have been issued, in particular the competitiveness compass, we have invented and we are proposing to our partners a new concept of clean trade and investment partnerships. This includes, on the one hand, all the trade measures that we're having. So all the tools on the clean tech sector. So it's only one sectoral approach. But on those sectors which cover energy, critical raw materials, or the clean tech approach, sustainable fuels, we make a package with all the projects we're having under Global Gateway and all the trade negotiations that we have ongoing and in any other partnership. And we present this as a package. And this is clearly discussed together with the political reforms as part of the negotiations we're having. And the first example of that will be the first summit over, I think, same as we last time I was here, I think it's 7 years. We are preparing a summit between the European Union and South Africa. And this concept will be proposed to South Africa in the coming period. So really making this kind of development offer part of the preparation of the summit. So this means that at institutional level, we are also consulting and collaborating quite closely with the External Action Service, but also with other DGs in the Commission, which are responsible for sectoral policies. Energy trade in the first round, energy rule for everything which is linked to European competitiveness, critical raw materials. So a much bigger effort of coordination. Sorry.
No, please. Thank you, sorry.
I'm okay.
Got some more water. Jessica.
Hi, my name is Jessica. I want to thank you for being here, and I have a question regarding what you mentioned at the beginning of your lecture. You said Russia and China, that's one of the reasons why you shifted, why not you specifically, but why the Commission has shifted its focus away from giving money away without any strings attached. And I'm wondering how this impacts the EU's bargaining power with making these partnerships with these countries when they can get the money from China, for example, with no strings attached. And you can see that more and more development projects are being opened as well, like in Southeast Africa with the crude oil pipeline. And I'm wondering, whether the EU is losing its position as a good bargaining partner because of this new shift in policy.
I'm not sure I said that bluntly. The shift in European policy was because of Russia and China.
You can't introduce Chatham House rules retroactively. No, we didn't say it at the beginning, Paul. But, okay, yeah.
So no, it's really to strengthen the positioning of the European Union and to get partnership that deliver on the ground because of the lack of sufficient financial means and the need for impact. But how are the countries positioning? You would be surprised by the number of countries which call on us because they are looking for a third way. So yes, there is an interest, and in regions which are very close to one or another of the countries you mentioned. Then, of course, it's not, our offer is not exclusive. Meaning we are working with partners who are partnering with China, partnering with Russia, but our offer has distinctive features which also interest our partners. And these are essentially the fact that the values in concrete terms on which our offer is based. And the values are the criteria, if we look at mining, or the criteria for environmental protection, protection against child labor, but digitalization and protection of data. So there is an appetite for this. And what is interesting also for our partners is the comprehensive offer we're making. We're not just coming with direct money for an infrastructure, but we're providing all the services around this. And if I give you an example, Costa Rica. Costa Rica wanted to buy e-buses. we came with a proposal as the European Union, just not to just provide e-buses, but to provide the full ecosystem with charging stations, docking stations, training, development of specific centers in the city where local workers can develop and assemble some of the elements of the buses. So having something much more comprehensive. And this made the offer attractive. So we're having, it's a competition, but we sense a real interest for the European offer from our partners.
So they're more complete, I mean, the proposals. It's not just the sort of bottom line of the Chinese. There was also always the fact that Chinese labor was
This is the
frequently
point.
part of the.
Is what we propose is something which allows local development and growth. So our objective is to create local jobs, and this is what the governments want. They don't want only a quick, cheap infrastructure, but if you can demonstrate that you're providing much more employment potentialities through your project, because they will end up having the infrastructure, but they will also have all the services around and the training facilities for the local population. This is where the offer becomes attractive.
So far, discussion's been mainly about China and Russia mentioned, but there are also other powers which are more active now than they were. I mean, whether Iran, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates and others, is this also a part of the picture that you consider?
It's part of the picture, but I would like to get out from, it's not that this project Global Gateway is only defensive and seen as opposing. We haven't conceived it as opposing the Russian offer or the Chinese offer. It's really the projection of the European Union externally. And in some cases, we do cooperate. So you mentioned the Gulf. The Gulf is extremely active, but we have relations with the Gulf where we try to cooperate and bring them. The Gulf countries are rich countries, and there's a big banking sector, and they're part of the donor community. And we do have an interest to co-finance things with the Gulf states in places where we have a joint interest. And I was mentioning Central Asia. We have a huge project in Central Asia, which is the Trans-Caspian Transport Corridor that would link Europe, crossing all 5 Central Asia countries. This is a 30 billion euro project with different segments. And of course, we are chairing a donor coordination community where we want to work with the multilaterals, with the World Bank, the EBRD in particular, but where we're trying to bring other players. Turkey, you didn't mention, but Turkey is extremely active too, particularly in this region, the Gulf state, and other G7 members like Japan also has an interest. So it's not everything is about confrontation or competition. We also have an interest to cooperate on projects where we do see an added value.
Those of you following online, if you'd like to put any questions into the Q&A or the chat, I think Eleonora is following that. Justin.
Thank you very much for this talk. I think it's been particularly interesting, especially for our students doing the Masters in European Public Policy, but not only. My question is a real quick one. You're now moving to big projects. Big projects mean big corruption. How does this come into the picture? How are you dealing with this, both on the EU side, but most of all in the countries where these big projects are being carried out?
When those big projects are implemented, we have delegated a lot our cooperation to European development banks. So they are essentially implemented centrally. We continue working on governance and rule of law programs in our partner countries, but actually those projects are much more implemented by external partners from the donors community done directly by the administration of the country. So in that sense, the corruption risks are not higher. But we do continue, we continue with budget support in some cases when this is the most effective tool. And there, of course, we have all the control systems and safeguards to make sure that the funds are used according to procedures. But I would say the working methods have changed in a way that the corruption risk doesn't look bigger with big infrastructure projects than they were with smaller human rights or human development interventions implemented by governments. And something I haven't said, is we have more than 100 delegations all over the world. So we have those projects are followed very closely locally in basically all partner countries.
I mean, corruption is one risk. Another risk, of course, is conflict. And you mentioned a little while ago the Democratic Republic of Congo and so on. I mean, how do we handle this, both in terms of assistance potentially, ideally, reducing the risk of conflict in some situations, depending on what's at stake, but also in terms of the delivery of assistance and projects that may be midway through in a situation where a conflict or even a war breaks out? How do you handle that?
Well, you mentioned Democratic Republic of Congo. We work well in DRC because we still have projects, we have structure, but we had a much more painful experience if you look at the Sahel, where, well, if we look at Niger after the coup 2 years ago, basically all interventions we're supporting have been suspended. And there is no way we can reinstate them. So what we do in those cases, well, we have a complementary approach. I focused essentially on the global gateway and all those infrastructure projects, which we can apply in 90% of the cases, I would say. But we also have countries or interventions which are either estranged governments or extremely fragile countries where we just can't implement this type of infrastructure because we don't have, or the local private sector is not developed at all that would allow us to invest in that way, or we absolutely don't want to have political relationship with the governments, and where we can't negotiate this type of project. I'm thinking of Myanmar, Afghanistan, Niger. And in those cases, we implement programs which are much closer to humanitarian assistance. So we work basically with the UN agencies and with NGOs. And we have, in that case, much more traditional type of interventions, smaller projects, essentially in the field of education, health, and access to basic needs and basic services. So we have a continuum. Depending on the regime of the country, on the political relationship we have with the countries, and in some cases we just can't develop. And in Niger, we had a fantastic budget support with a strong push from President Bazoum, which has been completely interrupted. In conflict-sensitive areas, same. We focus on the places where we can have an impact, and for the rest, for the places where really access is impaired by war, we work through, well, first we deploy humanitarian assistance, and then we work through UN agencies and NGOs.
Very good, thank you. Any other comments or questions? Yes, Jack.
I wanted to go back to the corruption, and thank you first very much. This is such a interesting and engaging, and you are facing a world that is changing, and you've been talking about China and Russia. That's not a development model. That is a quite distinct. And I wanted to raise that issue. That is, as you move into the big projects area, the competition for China, if I think both of Africa and Latin America, the Chinese have a model in which they do not disclose how many Chinese workers are coming to work on a project. They do not disclose the terms of it, nor the corruption that may be part of it. So the Chinese really have a different model that is delivered a lot faster for different reasons if we think of the new port in Peru, for example. So are you really talking about two different kinds of big projects? That is a developmental approach from the European Union, which is, and the Chinese are given the whole corruption side for themselves.
Well, we are insisting very much on the peculiarities of our model. But then, of course, we also undergo public procurement in the countries. And it doesn't mean that our offer is systematically accepted. And in some cases, some of our projects, for essentially public procurement reasons, are also implemented by Chinese companies, but according to our standards. So the end result remains the one we have committed, even though the project can be implemented by Chinese companies. But to your question,
I would just say, from the standpoint of developing countries, it's quite a dilemma because they are promised direct, things will be built and things will be built quickly, and that isn't exactly what really happens at the end. It's built quickly, but not built to Chinese specifications, not to the particular economy specifications.
yeah, but more and more the strings attached to the projects implemented with China are none. And countries are also conscious of their own strategic autonomy, and basically part of our offer is to support their own resilience. And their own resilience calls not to put all their eggs in the same basket. So in that case, many tell us we are interested in a European offer. Then up to us to make the offer appealing enough and to find the right companies that can implement the project. Because one of the shortfalls we're also having is you can have the best design project possible. If you don't prepare this in upfront with your own private sector, you may have projects where you have no EU bidders at all. Because we are working in risky environments. And our tools are aimed at de-risking, but it's also a new model. And you were mentioning war. We have provisions, and the EIB has a specific program to cover political risk, but it's not every project is covered against political risk. Of course, it's risky. But don't underestimate the interest of the partners for an EU offer.
I'm not underestimating that, but what I'm saying is there may be two different types of big projects. One in which they want accountability and transparency, and the other which they want speed and delivery.
Maybe just the last one or two questions. Some of us will be able to continue the discussion over dinner. Yes.
Hi, my name is Anne Keeley, and I am a MAIR student here and previously worked in Washington DC for about a year in the development sector. And obviously, all the changes in the US are having a significant impact right now on global development policy. But kind of a strategy or a talking point, I don't know, that was really popular in Washington over the past 10 to 20 years is locally led development. So when you were talking about the partners that you work with, like what would you say the percentage is of Western development partners versus locally on the ground partners?
Very difficult question. We aim at developing, working with local partners. So in each and every project, I concentrate in my presentation in trying to work with the private sector because, to be very honest, it's new to us. In the development work, it's really not in our DNA to bring European private companies with us. But when we are on the ground, the objective is to support the local private sector, in particular SMEs, and we have a very high number of projects in that endeavor. With this objective, we are organizing a lot of business fora in many countries to stimulate the exchanges, bring the companies, also build a bridge between the government and the companies to pass political message on the need for improved business environment. So I can't give you one, but we are working with a multitude of local partners. And every time in all the projects I mentioned, all those companies will work with local partners because this is where we're going to create local jobs. And we have many programs in terms of supporting development of SMEs, in particular intermediate lending with some of our banking institutions, which allow access to finance, microloans, guarantees, specific support for businesses run by young people and women. So I don't have a proportion, but it's much, I would say much more local private sector than European.
Thanks very much, Myriam. Maybe if some students want to follow up, they could possibly be in touch. And
Of course,
maybe you would put them in touch with some of your colleagues
with
who are
pleasure.
working if they have a research project or some such. Well, look, thank you so much for coming in the first place and for being so generous with your time and so open in your response, even to the most difficult questions. And we hope we can bring you back before long and for a long time. Thank you, Myriam.